column mean are more complex, like a random forest, and fill in the missing values one time. However, we'd prefer to have a way to represent the uncertainty inherent in this imputation process. No matter how good our model is, we don't know what the right answer should be by virtue of the data being missing. Rather than hiding this uncertainty, we would prefer to propagate it into our final estimates of the total victim population. We do this using multiple imputation, which is a family of methods in which the imputation process is repeated a number of times. And this results in a number of distinct versions of the imputed data set. So we'll have one version of the data set where the missing values are filled in one way, and another version of the data set where they are filled in a slightly different way. Some missing values may be the same across both imputed data sets, but in other cases, they may be different. This allows us to propagate the uncertainty from the imputation step into the final estimates. Just like there are a number of different methods for doing single imputation, there are many ways to do multiple imputation. Two methods that I commonly use are predictive mean matching, which in a certain sense resembles k-nearest neighbors, and again, tree-based models can be used in the multiple imputation framework as well. And now that we have a kind of basic understanding of the process of imputation, so filling in the missing data in the observed records, I'd like to turn our attention to the victims who are never documented. To do this, we'll use a different statistical method called multiple systems estimation, which is also known as capture-recapture or capture-mark-recapture in some other fields. The basic idea behind this method is that we would like to use information about the documentation patterns of the observed victims to estimate the total population size. And again, this includes victims that were never documented. We saw this earlier in the stylized data. The sources column represents which victims were documented in which list. Some victims appeared in only one list, while others were documented by two or more lists. These patterns, so the way in which these victims are documented, serves as the input to the multiple systems estimation model. Multiple systems estimation is technically possible, but you have to be willing to make very strong assumptions about the lists. These often don't seem plausible when working with human rights violation data. So when I apply these methods in my work, I only do so when I have 3 or more distinct lists available. As with imputation, many different multiple systems estimation models exist. They're both Bayesian and frequentist. Some examples include log linear models, decomposable graphical models, and latent class multiple capture-recapture, which is the model I often use in my work. To make what I've just explained a little more concrete, let's imagine we have 2 lists A and B, and a population of unknown size n. This example differs from the way that I construct my estimates in practice, but it's helpful to understand the intuition behind what multiple systems estimation is doing. Let's imagine that lists A and B are independent, and now I'd like to define some quantities. So the first quantity I would like to define is the probability of being on list A. So I'm going to call this P of A, and this is equal to A, so these are the number of people within the dark green circle, divided by n, the total size of the population. Similarly, the probability of being on list B is P of B, and that is B divided by n. Now I'd like to ask, what about the intersection between lists A and B? In the diagram, that's labeled as n, and that is sort of the dark gray people in the middle of A and B. The probability of being an M is therefore M divided by n. But because the lists are independent, so lists A and B are independent, we can rewrite this expression as the probability of being on list A times the probability of being on list B. That is, we can do A divided by n times B divided by n, which is just A times B over n squared. Rearranging the terms in this equation, we can say that our estimate of n is then equal to A times B divided by n. I think that this is really cool because using only the data we've observed, we now have this estimate of the entire population of victims, including the victims whose stories were never documented. To wrap things up, I just want to talk a little bit about how we use multiple imputation and multiple systems estimation together to get estimates that include both uncertainty from imputation and from the multiple systems estimation model. This process has 3 general steps. The first step is creating the multiply imputed data sets. So I will create, let's say, 10 multiply imputed data sets using an R package called MICE. And this stands for multivariate imputation through change equation. Again, as I explained earlier, these 10 imputed data sets will all be slightly different because the imputation process is probabilistic and allows for variation, which is exactly what we want to see because we don't know what the correct answers are. Next, so after we have the 10 replicates of the multiple imputations, so the 10 versions of the imputed data sets, we're going to calculate multiple systems estimation estimates for the population of interest on each of these imputed data sets. So at the end of this process, I will have 10 sets of results, one for each of the imputed data sets. I do the multiple systems estimation estimates using the R package LCMCR, which refers to, again, latent class multiple capture recapture. This is a Bayesian framework, so my 10 sets of results are 10 vectors of draws from the posterior distribution of the probable number of victims. Finally, we're going to take these 10 sets of results and combine them to get a point estimate of the most likely number of victims and a measure of our uncertainty. And what's most important about this measure of uncertainty is that this uncertainty is going to account for both uncertainty in the imputation and the uncertainty in the multiple systems estimation model. And that's very important to us. So we're propagating the error from the imputation into the final results. There are a number of different rules for combining the results from multiple imputation. In our case, we are generally able to say that the results resemble a normal distribution after we apply a log transformation. So we can use combination rules that make normality assumptions without too much issue. And finally, just to close, these are the references I referenced throughout the talk today, if you're interested in learning a little bit more. And thank you so much for joining my talk today. If you'd like to discuss anything I mentioned here in greater detail, you can reach me at mariag@hrdag.org. And happy International Women's Day and enjoy the rest of WiDs.
Thank you so much, Maria. I'm a big fan of the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, and I really recommend that you check out the incredible work that they do all around the world for human rights. We're going on to our next Tech Vision talk, and this is a talk by Tanvir Shada Mahmood. And what I like so much about her, she's going to do double duty today. She's giving a talk, and then after our break, she will reappear in our panel, which is really quite incredible. So thank you so much for coming and joining us today. Tanvir.
Good morning, everyone. How is the day today? It's a brilliant day, not so cold. And for those who are coming from the East Coast, so today I'm going to talk about a fun topic for me, at least, and I hope it is fun for you. It's something that we took on during running our Medical Civ Radiology Grand Challenge, but I thought this was an appropriate forum to discuss it so you could see what does it take to build a data science application from end to end. I just want to acknowledge my team, and you can see that there are clinicians, machine learning researchers, data scientists, medical imaging researchers, you name it, you need all of them to pull off something like this. So you might say, where is the field of radiology today? Right from the time when we did our Isaac Watson exhibit at RSNA, that just stirred up the field of radiology, saying, oh my, AI is coming to replace us. And then both radiologists and AI companies got into the fray, and you can see a lot of them still maybe around and trying to make money. And a lot of FDA-cleared products also out there. But adoption in radiology workflows is still slow. And if you see why is that the case, it's because it doesn't help them if you just do a few of these findings. You want to be able to cover at least one modality in its entirety to get somewhere. And the kind of reports you may generate from there, just saying what the labels are, is not good enough for replacing in their clinical workflows. So in the Medical Civ Radiology Grand Challenge, which was targeted towards building AI assistants that are provably good enough, this problem was posed to us. Can you pick one modality, such as a chest X-ray, and do a full preliminary read, and to be done at the level that I couldn't distinguish between a human read and a machine read? So if you've got a chest X-ray, you need to get to the right, and you can see over there that there is very fine-grained descriptions of findings with laterality, location, and so on. So this was a task. Now you may say, why chest X-rays? So these are, obviously, they are the most common imaging exam, so obviously maybe there is a business case for it. But you'll see that we took it for a different reason. But then the more important thing was, in a data science problem, labels are somehow known or given, but in this particular case, we had no idea how many findings are there if we have to claim coverage of all. And then we had to say, if we had to be better than the radiologists, we needed to know how good are the radiologists themselves. And then the third thing is, if you make all of those, can you now describe the findings in a way that is natural looking, that you couldn't really tell who did it? So here you can see the reason we took on with these are, even though they're the most common, they're some of the hardest to interpret. They could have technical assessment issues. This is what a radiologist has to look through as they go through their workflow. These are not technically ready to interpret. Then there are things that are opacities, which are all essentially what they try to interpret, and know whether the opacities are due to consolidation or atelectasis. Then you go over and look at tubes and lines that may be present, particularly if you're in an AP at an in-hospital environment, whether the lines and tubes are placed, and you want to know what type of line and tube is it. Is it a nasogastric tube, or is it an IJ line, or a Swan-Ganz catheter? Then you need to know whether there are any implants and things that you may want to interpret from opacities to distinguish between whether there's a nodule or it's just an opacity of some other kind. So you can see that this is a very hard problem. And in order to build something that have an AI scale, you want to address many different problems, not just for AI, which we know we have to do, but also on the radiologist side, setting up the benchmarks and establishing ways of defining ground truth and to measure their performance and then measure machines' performance as well. So let me show how we actually do this right now. So if I can run, here's an image that comes in. The system can actually interpret, extract the anatomical regions, and as it starts assessing, it can spit out a report that looks like that. And you can just pick up any image and try to send it as a service. It interprets and gives a result like this. And the images could be pretty bad, as you can see from here. These are web images, and then there are findings discussed in there. Okay, so let's go to the first question. We have to know what are the findings and how many findings are there. This was a cataloging exercise that required extensive clinician work time and bringing data from both textbooks as well as from data driven from reports, looking at reports. And we did an extensive cataloging of findings, over 2,000 findings when you look at it at a very fine-grained level. But even if you roll up, there is considerable number of findings, much larger than what typically people use with the 14 labels that you see for NIH data set that is out there, and all the derivatives. The second thing was to be able to acquire multi-institutional data sets, and these are data sets that come from a variety of hospitals, both national and international, so you could have distributions, different incidence distributions, and as you can see from the incidence distributions, not all findings are occurring as commonly. So you need to build machines that can tolerate such imbalance in data as well. Then the next thing is to be able to label. Much of this data that's available is unlabeled. And even if it is labeled, it's only for 14 findings. When you're talking about 2,000 findings, how are you going to label such data sets? Manual labeling was nearly impossible. So we needed to develop very good methods for using the companion radiology reports to be able to interpret. And here's where the chest X-ray lexicon that we developed came in handy. This, together with natural language parsing, and looking at the structure of sentences, we were able to do phrasal grouping. This is a work that won the Best Paper Award in EMEA a couple of years ago. And basically build this structure to form something called fine-grained finding patterns. Once you have those patterns, it's relatively easy to spit out an English language sentence, such as something over here. You can say, for the anatomical finding, left basal atelectasis is something that you can spit out. Still, it turns out that even this method would have some issues with negations, which tend to be still a bottleneck for many of these. But we have gotten it down to fairly good accuracy enough that the error that you get from such labeling is tolerable in the building of models. Okay, so now it's time to build models. You've got data, you've got labels, it's time to build models. So the first approach we took was that we are going to label it individually by taking classes of findings like tubes and lines or technical assessments. And we got pretty good ROC curves with the data sets and the models that we used. But our experiment revealed that actually it is possible to build one single model that covers all the findings. Because of the incidence distribution rates, there is something you can do to tune the model towards these findings to adapt for sensitivities and specificities based on the likelihood of occurrence. And as a result, we ended up with building this model which exploited the latest in computer vision, feature pyramids, dilated blocks, global score quilling. For all those who use computer vision models know these are popular techniques, but put them in unique combinations to do this. Based on that, you can now see the kind of findings we can detect would say something like moderate pleural effusion in the right lower lobe. That's actually a label. So it should be relatively easy now to put forward a sentence that describes it pretty close to that. The system is also able to detect them fairly accurately where these volumes were. So you can see low lung volumes, hyperaerations. Many of them are located correctly as well. So now the question is, how do I generate a report out of this? So obviously there is labels that are already, the findings, distributions that are given, but in order to make sure that the sentence is as natural as possible, we actually exploited prior radiology reports and combined machine learning with document retrieval and a variety of techniques to actually construct sentences out of those. So these would then have the problem that they would be actually natural language like, but also describe the findings as correctly as possible. We did these evaluations and we have published papers, so you can see some of the sentences that are being generated by such a report generation method. Okay, so in the last section, I will talk about how we said we were going to build a machine that was comparable, and how do we prove that? So we had to now conduct studies on the radiologist side to actually build benchmark data sets. So we used a ground truth labeling process called triple consensus with adjudication as a validation, and then brought them and actually recorded nearly 2,000 chest x-rays with ground truth labels across 60 plus findings. And then we looked at the performance of entry-level radiologists on detecting these, and then compared them with machines in an objective way as we could, and this is the paper in JAMA. And you can see from this ROC curves that for some findings, radiologists are better than machines, and for others, machines are better than radiologists, and for some of these, like normal-abnormal discrimination, they're right on the curve as such. So in fact, the overall conclusion from that was that there isn't much statistically significant difference between sensitivities of AI and radiologists, but specificities, you can actually tune them to be much higher for machines based on the performance considerations that you choose and the prevalence distributions of these labels as such. So this was actually encouraging that we can actually find machines that are capable of achieving this performance. So this, you can see some of the performances of which ones radiologists are good at and which ones machines are good at. Okay, so now come to the last part of it, which is building a Turing test for radiology AI. How do we do that? So one of the methodology, this is something we did with partnership with universities as well, and we rolled out initial versions at RSNA, and then later on at a final demonstration at a symposium, where we had these interfaces actually given to attendings to go and look at chest x-rays and their reports already generated with an unknown process and have them rate this. So this is the final result that came from here, and I want to focus a little bit of time on this and describe to you the event and the excitement that it generated when we were in this symposium. We had actually set aside 3 dark rooms for attendings to go and evaluate, and the reports that were randomly collected were actually distributed among these 3 radiologists. One of them just got machine reports, one of them got radiologist reports. One of them got a mixture, but none of them had told who got what. So that's what they did. They went and evaluated them. And the kind of results that they were looking for is to see if they are quality from a diagnostic purposes, whether it's an excellent quality report. So these are criteria that American College of Radiology also uses. And then a perception score in some sense of the satisfaction for how well are you satisfied with the report that you have. And then we were watching the distributions as the numbers were coming in. And we hoped and prayed that our numbers would look better. So you can see from here, across the four categories that we looked, when we overlay the two, you can see that the reads, for at least for this batch of things that we used, it seemed to have come out better on the more excellent quality reports than for the radiologists. In this particular case. And then the impression scores also went along these lines. Okay, to summarize, what we did was something that was attempting a grand challenge going from end to end, because we started at a place where we said we'll take on a goal saying how can we show how good are machines. But we actually, talking about human-centered AI, the previous speaker, we had to actually go back and see how good are the humans. And most of the studies and quotations, about 26% error rate in radiologists, is anecdotal or for specific findings. But if you now have this many class of findings, how good are they? You had to actually do those studies as well. It would be nice if someone else did those studies, but given a team and where we were going with this and the duration, we had to recruit different institutions and come work with them collectively to go through this process as such. So this is a lesson learned in data science, is that the next wave of things that you will see in AI models come after is go after fine-grained findings. I think the coarse grains have already been addressed now, and in future you will see machines going after things that are much more finer level of detail when it comes to perceiving things. Thank you.
We're going to see her back again after the break in our health panel. So that's what's coming up. Now, I know you're incredibly eager to have this break and to connect with people, because as soon as you thought we had a break just a little bit ago, you're off. But before we go, just a few announcements about this. First of all, I want to say to our online audience at Hop-In that you're going to be enjoying interviews during this break created by our media collaborator, theCUBE. For those of you here, you will see them outside in the studio. It's really fun to witness them do that. You may wonder, with as many women as we have, will we have enough bathrooms? But we do. All of the bathrooms close by are converted to female or women only. Gender-neutral bathrooms are at the end of the hallway. So just keep that in mind. We have coffee outside. We have a job board outside. If you're looking for people to work with, if you have openings or you're looking for a job, check out the job board. We're going to be back here at 9:50 exactly Pacific time, right? About 20 minutes. And you have homework for this break. And the homework is meet as many new people as you can. See you in 20 minutes.
Live from Stanford University, it's theCUBE, covering Stanford Women in Data Science 2020. Brought to you by SiliconANGLE Media.
Hi, and welcome to theCUBE. I'm your host, Sonia Tagare, and we're live at Stanford University covering the 5th Annual WiDs Women in Data Science Conference. Joining us today is Emily Glassberg-Sands, the head of data science at Coursera. Emily, welcome to theCUBE.
Thanks, so great to be on.
So tell us a little bit more about what you do at Coursera.
Yeah, absolutely. So Coursera is the world's largest platform for higher education. We partner with about 160 universities and 20 industry partners, and we provide top learning content from data science to child nutrition to about 50 million learners around the world. I lead the end-to-end data team, so spanning data engineering, data science, and machine learning.
Wow. And we just had Daphne Kohler on earlier this morning, who's the co-founder of Coursera, Absolutely. And she's also the one who hired you.
Yeah.
So tell us more about that relationship.
Well, I love Daphne. I think the world of her. As I will talk about shortly, she actually didn't hire me from the start. The first answer I got from Coursera was a no, that the company wasn't quite ready for someone who wasn't a full-blown coder. But I eventually talked her into bringing me on board, and she's been an inspiration ever since. I think one of my first memories of Daphne was when she was painting the vision of what's possible with online education. And she said, think about the first movie. The first movie was literally just filming a play on stage. You'll appreciate this, given your background in film. And then fast forward to today and think about what's possible in movies that could never be possible on the brick and mortar stage. And the analog she was creating was that the first MOOC, the first massive open online course, was very simply filming a professor in a classroom. But she was thinking forward to today and tomorrow and 5 years from now, and what's possible in terms of how data and technology can transform how educators teach and how learners learn.
That's very cool. So how has Coursera changed from when she started it to now?
So it's evolved a lot. So I've been at Coursera about 6 years. When I joined, the company had less than 50 people. Today, we're 10 times that size. We have 500. I think there have been obviously dramatic growth in the platform overall, but three main changes to our business model. The first is we've moved from partnering exclusively with universities to recognizing that actually a lot of the most important education for folks in the labor market is being taught within companies. So Google is super incentivized to train people in Google Cloud, Amazon in AWS. Folks need to learn Tableau and a whole host of other softwares. So we've expanded to including education that's provided not just by top institutions like Stanford, but also by top institutions that are companies like Amazon and Google. The second big change is we've recognized that while for many learners an individual course or a MOOC is sufficient, some learners need access to full degree, diploma-bearing credentials. So we've moved to the degree space. We now have 14 degrees live on the platform, masters in computer science and data science, but also in business, accounting, and so on. And the third major change is, I think, just sort of as the world has evolved to recognize that folks need to be learning throughout their lives, there's also general consensus that it's not just on the individuals to learn, but also on their companies to train them and governments as well. And so we launched Coursera for Enterprise, which is about providing learning content through employers and through governments so we can reach a wider swath of individuals who might not be able to afford it themselves.
And how are you able to use data science to track individual user preferences and user behavior?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you can imagine, right, 50 million learners. They're from almost every country in the world. They're from a range of different backgrounds, have a bunch of different goals. And so I think what you're getting at is that so much of creating the right learning experience for each person is about personalizing that experience. And we personalize throughout the learner journey. So in discovery, up front, when you first join the platform, we ask you, what's your career goal? What role are you in today? And then we help you find the right content to close the gap. As you're moving through courses, we predict whether or not you need some additional support, whether it's a fully automated intervention like a behavioral nudge emphasizing growth mindset, or a pedagogical nudge like recommending the right review material, and provide it to you. And then we also do the same to accelerate support staff on campus. So we identify for each individual what type of human touch might they need, and we serve up to support staff recommendations for who they should reach out to, whether it's a counselor reaching out to a degree student who hasn't logged in for a while, or a TA reaching out to a degree student who's struggling with an assignment. So data really powers all of that, understanding someone's goals, their backgrounds, the content that's going to close the gap, as well as understanding where they need additional support and what type of help we can provide.
And how are you able to track this data? Are you using A/B testing?
Yeah, great question. So we call it eventing level data, which basically tracks what every learner is doing as they're moving through the platform. And then we use A/B testing to understand the influence of kind of our big features. So say we roll out a new search ranking algorithm or a new learning experience. We would A/B test that, yes, to understand how learners in the new variant compare to learners in the old variant. But for many of our machine learned systems, we're actually doing more of a multi-arm banded approach, where on the margin, we're changing a little bit the experience people have to understand what effect that has on their downstream behavior, separate from this mass hold in or hold out A/B test.
And so today you're giving a talk about Coursera's latest data products. Give us a little insight about that.
So I'm covering 3 data products that we've launched over the last couple of years. The first 2 are oriented around really helping learners be successful in the learning experience. So the first is predicting when learners are going to need additional nudges and intervening in fully automated ways to get them back on track. The second is about identifying learners who need human support and serving up really easily interpretable insights to support staff so they can reach out to the right learner with the right help. And then the third is a little bit different. It's about once learners are out in the labor market, how can they credibly signal what they know so that they can be rewarded for that learning on the job. And this is a product called skill scoring, where we're actually measuring what skills each learner has up to what level. So I can, for example, compare that to the skills required in my target career or show it to my employer so I can be rewarded for what I know.
And that can be really helpful when people are creating resumes by ranking how much of a skill that they have.
Absolutely. So it's really interesting when you talk about resumes. So much of what's shown on resumes are traditional credentials. Things like what school did you go to, what did you major in, what jobs have you had, and as you and I both know, there's unequal access to the school you go to or the early jobs you get. And so part of the motivation behind skill scoring is to create more equitable or fair or accessible signals for the labor market. So we're really excited about that direction.
And do you think companies are taking that into consideration when they're hiring people who, say, have like a 5 out of 5 skill in computer science, but they didn't go to Stanford? Do you think they're taking that?
Absolutely. I think companies are hungry to find more diverse talent. And the biggest challenge is when you look at people from diverse backgrounds, it's hard to know who has what skills. And so skill scoring provides a really valuable input. We're actually seeing it in use already by many of our enterprise customers who are using it to identify who of their internal employees is well positioned for new opportunities or new roles. For example, I may have a bunch of back-end engineers. If I know who's good in math and machine learning and statistics, I can actually tap those folks to transition over to machine learning roles. And so it's used both as an external signal in the external labor market as well as an internal signal within companies.
And just our last question here, what advice would you give to young women who are either out of college or just starting college who are interested in data science, who maybe, haven't majored in a typical data science major? What advice would you give to them?
So I love that you asked who haven't majored in a typical data science major. I'm actually an economist by training. And I think that's probably the reason why I was at first rejected from Coursera, because an economist is a very strange background to go into data science. I think my primary advice to those young women would be to really not get too lost in the data science, in the math, in the algorithms, and instead to remember that those are a means to an end, and the end is impact. So think about the problems in the world that you care about. For me, it's education. For others, it's healthcare or personal finance or a range of other issues. And remember that data science provides this vast set of tools that you can use to solve the problems you care about most.
That's great. Thank you so much for being on theCUBE.
Thank you.
I'm Sonia Tagare. Thank you so much for watching theCUBE, and stay tuned for more.
Have smaller population, or you have already tapped out of all the other options that are available to you. Desalination is an expensive solution. Costs a lot of money to build this infrastructure, and also again depends on this centralized approach that we will build something and provide resources to people from that location. So it's very costly to build this kind of solutions. I think for California, we still have plenty of water that we can save and repurpose, I would say, and also we still can do recycling and reuse. We can capture our stormwater and reuse it. So there's so many other cheaper, more accessible options available before we go ahead and build a desalination plant.
And you're going to be talking about sustainable water resource management. So tell us a little bit more about that too.
So sustainable water resource management, and occasionally I use also the word like building resilient water future, is all about diversifying our water supply and being mindful of how we use our water. Every drop of water that we use, it's degraded and needs to be cleaned up and put back in the environment. So it always starts from the bottom. The more you save, the less impact you have on the environment. The second thing is you want to make sure every drop of water that we use, we can use it as many times possible and not make it, not take it, use it, lose it right away, but actually be able to use it multiple times for different purposes. Another point that's very important is actually majority of the water that we use on a daily basis doesn't need to be extremely clean drinking water quality. For example, if you tell someone that we are flushing down our toilets drinkable water, it would surprise you that we would spend this much time and resources and money and energy.
Welcome back from break. Please find your seats, and I know it's hard, but I'm going to ask you to stop talking. It's impossible. We are very excited to start this morning session with a panel on health issues. Tanvir has already warmed us up, talking about her work in radiology, and we'll be addressing so much more in this panel that is going to be moderated by my wonderful colleague, Tina Hernandez-Buzar. You can see all the panelists in the list, and they're also going to be introduced to you by Tina. So welcome, Tina, and the panel.
We have Tanvir here. She's coming after that lovely talk she gave. She had to get some coffee, and she is on her way to stage right now. So thank you so much for having this opportunity to speak with you this morning. We have an absolutely wonderful panel here today, and I'm really excited to have with us these exciting professionals in data science and healthcare. Here comes Tanvir, who's going to join us. My name is Tina Hernandez-Buzard. I'm an associate professor in medicine in the Department of Data Science at Stanford University, and I'm here with three outstanding leaders in healthcare. First, we have Sylvia Providis, the chair of the Department of Biomedical Data Science at Stanford. We have Janus Yazani from Chief of the Division of Rheumatology at University of San Francisco, Zuckerberg General Hospital. And we have Dan Tanvir, who you met earlier, who is IBM Fellow and Chief Scientist at IBM Research. So to start this morning, we're each going to give you a brief overview of the work we're doing in data science and healthcare, and then we're going to discuss some of the opportunities and challenges we see in the field moving forward. So let me start with sharing with you some of the work we do in my lab, and I'm going to get us going, and then I'm going to pass it down the row here. So I'm going to get started, as we've heard today, just the opportunities we've had for mentorship and getting started in the field. So I'm from a very small town. My father is Mexican. He was a farm worker. And so education wasn't something very typical in my family. And I went into my undergraduate school, and I was paired with a mentor who just changed everything in my life. He really believed in me and opened opportunities for me that I didn't even think were possible. And so my career has been, like others we heard this morning, not straightforward, but I've done different paths into healthcare and data science. Data has always been my strong point, and so merging data science and healthcare has just been a great opportunity for me. And it was through my mentorship at undergraduate that he opened opportunities. So I went and pursued a master's degree in public health, and then I just kept on learning a PhD in computer science, and then another master's degree in health services research. So I really have been able to combine these two fields to develop a unique niche where we're combining data science and healthcare. I think one perspective I bring to my work is I really have a diverse knowledge of different cultures, different societies, different social economic classes, and I understand how important it is to incorporate that when we look into healthcare and healthcare fields. And so as data scientists, I think there's many opportunities to advance the field. Specifically in my lab, we work on developing different AI technologies. In fact, I'm doing some work with Tanvir down here, developing a cancer patient digital twin, and that concept of what it is to have a virtual twin when you're undergoing cancer therapy to really understand optimal treatment pathways, identify potential outcomes, and identifying information that you can present to the caregiver to have these shared decision conversations. We develop these models, and we include things, all different types of models, deep learning, machine learning. We do a lot of natural language processing to mine medical records to really see if we can better capture the patient voice. I'm a very strong advocate of we need better technologies and tools to capture the patient voice and integrate that into routine care so we know patient values and goals. And we do that using different NLP technologies, transfer learning, et cetera. So you see, I think it's a very exciting time to be in the healthcare field. There's so many challenges and so many opportunities, and technology and data are really a path forward where we can better incorporate and really get to the next step of precision medicine, where the treatments and the technologies we develop are personalized. They take into account different patient perspectives, patient goals, patient values, and move us closer to an optimal treatment pathway. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sylvia, and she's going to give her perspective on the work she's doing and her experience in the data science field. Sylvia.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tina. That was really interesting. So it's really wonderful to be with you today. My research is focused on data-driven computational models of cancer biology and cancer outcomes. And I thought what I would do is just tell you a little bit how I got into this field. I finished my PhD in electrical engineering here at Stanford in Information Sciences Lab. And I worked with Al Makovsky in MR spectroscopic imaging, where we were trying to apply statistical image analysis methods to spatially resolve a specific metabolite called lactate as an early indicator for brain tumors. And when I finished my PhD, I loved what I had done, but I got very interested in a very different question. And that question was, can we use MRI to screen for cancer? MRI is very expensive technology, and at the time it was kind of a crazy idea. And I told my advisor I didn't want to pursue image analysis. I wanted to pursue this really different path. And he hooked me up with a healthcare economist, Alan Garber, and I also ended up with a master's in health services research. I ended up doing a postdoctoral fellowship after my PhD, and I used my engineering background, leveraging data on screening in breast cancer mammography, asking the question, could we leverage this data and transfer the knowledge from screening trials mammography into a setting where we were screening for breast cancer with MRI, specifically in women who had high risk for breast cancer because they carried a mutation BRCA1 or BRCA2. So we developed a simulation model, not unlike this digital twin concept, of a randomized controlled trial that had never been done and has never been done to date, of women randomized into standard of care, which is mammography, versus MRI plus mammography. And we ended up getting it published in JAMA and showed that it was effective to add MRI screening to women who carried a BRCA mutation. And then the next year, the American Cancer Society used that publication together with other evidence to develop a clinical guideline for women undergoing MRI screening if they carried a BRCA mutation. So I was really excited about that. By this time, I was now a faculty member in the radiology department, and I was thinking about this problem and had gotten interested in underlying these models were clinical models of disease progression. And we had folks at Stanford, in particular, Pat Brown, had developed the DNA microarray. And at the time, folks at Stanford were generating the global transcriptome of tumors across thousands and thousands of patients. So it was a lot of data. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to take this data and sort of redo that underlying natural history model, but make it more molecularly specific. And so I've kind of pivoted again, but when you have skills in data science, you can actually apply them in many different ways. And so I ended up developing models of disease progression, of molecular disease progression of cancer by integrating many multi-omic data sets. And I was able to pivot because the NCI actually had an RFA asking folks like me to come into the space of cancer biology. They pretty much said in the RFA, you don't need to have a cancer biology background. We need people who think like you. And so I was able to put a team together at Stanford, and we got funded, and we've been funded for over 15 years now. So it's been a very exciting journey for me, and the upshot for me is what you heard earlier today: pursue your passion, because that's what's going to take you through your career. You're always going to have new challenges, but if you're really interested in the problem you're trying to solve, you're going to rise up to that challenge.
Thank you, Sylvia. And I think it's really important just to highlight what you said is if you have the data science skills, it's really easy to pivot across domains and across important topics and take advantage of those. Because people are always looking for somebody with really strong data science skills to come and address a different challenge, right? So thank you. All right. Jinus, do you want to go ahead and take the floor?
Sure. So really a privilege to be here today, and we're the opposite of a manel, which I'm very excited about. A lot of the themes in my career have actually been very similar to the previous two speakers. My journey on my current path actually started during my medical training. I was a rheumatology fellow at UCSF. I was working in public hospitals and in more private settings, and I just noticed that the care that patients got was uneven. There were disparities like right in front of us. And I think all of us who actually have gotten healthcare or taken a loved one to get healthcare realize that that's true. You can get one advice when you go to one place and different advice when you go to a different place. And so this was sort of the thing that I wanted to work on and solve. And my career has really been about putting together the pieces in my field to try to make care more equitable and more standardized. And so, one of the first problems that I worked on was actually just trying to get people to put patient-reported outcomes into the electronic health record in a standardized way. Electronic health records right now are primarily used for billing, and they don't actually include some of the things that really matter to patients. And so that was the first thing that we tried to do. We tried to actually agree on what outcomes should be measured, and I had to learn a lot about measurement and about electronic health record design and about how to actually get clinicians to do things like put these outcomes into the electronic health record. Next, we wanted to aggregate this data. And so that entailed building a registry, and we wanted to do this on a national level. We wanted, to connect the electronic health records of clinicians across the country so that we could actually study the quality of care, find out where the gaps were, and then go back and try to make a difference. And so this entailed, using clinical informatics and learning about registry infrastructure. I know a lot about privacy and security because we were asking people to share, protected health information on a scale that hadn't been done before. And this was very successful. We were able to build a national registry with the American College of Rheumatology. It has 2.5 million patients in it. About 1/3 of all US rheumatologists participate now. Once we had the data, then the next task was really to use data science and, my background in epidemiology and biostatistics to try to understand health disparities, to try to understand where there were gaps in care. And so this entailed, developing quality measures, applying them, and a whole lot of data cleaning, which isn't always glamorous, but it's so important. And then now, I'm focused a lot on human-centered design and implementation science. I'm interested in taking all the things that we've learned from data back to the bedside. We're building things like dashboards and quality improvement toolkits so that we can actually, clinician by clinician, try to provide feedback that's meaningful and get people to change practice, reduce health disparities. And I think, I have dabbled in many different things, and I haven't had a narrow area of focus. But I think, like the previous two speakers, I feel really passionate about health equity. I feel passionate about quality of care. And so everything that I've done has sort of, circled around trying to solve this important problem.
Great, thank you. And there's a lot of commonality in all of our work, as you can tell. And so Tanvir has already given a wonderful talk this morning, but she has more to tell us. So Tanvir, we're looking forward to the additional, things you can share with your work and what you have, your insights that you've driven.
Okay, maybe I can give a little bit of historical perspective because I've been in this field for a while. So, as you may know, I'm one of the underrepresented minorities, I would say, come from a very conservative Muslim family. And it was a big deal in those days to send a girl unmarried alone to go get a PhD in another country. So we made those because education to us was like a pilgrimage. And so when I was in India, I used to teach courses in artificial intelligence, the Feigenbaum kind. I used to follow the Feigenbaum's Handbook of AI. And my first forays were in speech signal processing and behind the Harpy speech understanding system. My advisor was working on that at CMU. So anyway, I came to MIT, and the day I landed, I was so excited to be in the AI lab because this is the place for doing artificial intelligence work. And then the professor, Jerry Sussman, who used to be there, I think he's still around, he would say, "Oh, you came too late, AI is over." And here I was like, what do? I came here to do PhD. So I got involved in a few interesting projects in the first year. So that helped me look at the field from a broad perspective. My first year was in building vacuum cleaner robots, some of which you now see in the market, the Roombas, early prototypes of those, to knowledge representation and reasoning, to landed in computer vision. At that time, vision was a thriving field, but not very commercially thriving. And the question that was posed to me was, well, we've solved the recognition problem. So the two other problems that are left to be solved are correspondence and selection. And the selection problem was the attentional selection problem that I took on. And now I know attention is a big word in these societies, but attention in those days was also something that we took on in computer vision. And from there we moved to looking at searching for images or from a content-based retrieval field. And then when it came to the time, so computer vision wasn't very hard in those days. Now I see that it has changed completely. But when the time came to see what can we apply, and I've been fortunate to be part of exploratory projects throughout my career. So there was an idea, think of it as you are pretending to a bunch of startups, sort of a bunch of venture capitalists, and then have an idea that you get some funding to explore some area. So I rounded up a bunch of usual suspects who were working in computer vision and said, let's go address a problem. And the problem happens to correspond to a personal story of mine where my father was misdiagnosed during an emergency for an ischemic stroke when he actually had a hemorrhagic stroke. And the resident that was in the ICU did the misdiagnosis, and then that led to some consequences. Now, fortunately, he recovered, but that gave me, is there some way in which we can get AI to help in such decision making, provide alternative hypotheses, or at least present the evidence so that there is some sort of caution, particularly to those who are not trained and are still serving, because they are the only ones out there on the field at that point in time. So that led to the work in healthcare, and as we went through, you can see the progression of that in the work I described today. So that's my field, motivated by real-world problems and across many different fields. And I think AI is not over. In fact, it's still starting. And if I look at the capabilities of systems today, I feel like there is a lot in human capability that we haven't yet reached, that there's more to go.
Great. Thank you. And so you can see we all have very different areas of interest we're working on. And one thing, so as moderator, I'm going to take the prerogative to kind of change the questions that I thought we might ask. But one thing I think is really important that we've heard a lot in the literature is sort of the bias and the fairness of the algorithms we develop. And certainly in healthcare, this is really important because some of the biases that come up in the healthcare issues, they are, we get allocation bias. So certain patients might be less, identified as needing particular resources, things like that. And so it's something that is really, really important in the healthcare field, as with many other fields. And a lot of the bias that we develop when we're developing our algorithms can come from data representativeness. And so it's something that we think about a lot in our field. and particularly in my lab, how are we capturing data from diverse populations? How do we ensure the data we have is really representative of the population for whom we're going to apply these algorithms to? And certainly when we think about, like the work in my lab is incorporating the patient's voice, which patients' voices do we have? It's people who come to the healthcare system when we use our electronic medical records. It's patients who are engaged. It's patients who are reaching out. But there's a whole nother population who might just need just as much resources, if not more resources, that often aren't represented in our data. And so I think there's a lot of challenges to think about, how do we capture data across these more diverse populations? And what we're thinking about in our lab is, it can't be the same technologies that we apply just unanimously across the field. Different populations are going to need to we're going to need to capture these data using different types of technologies, and really understanding these different technologies and how they play a role is going to be really important. And this is true not only for patient-reported outcomes, but also when we think about diversity in imaging and things like that. We were recently looking at images for lung cancer, and we noticed that over 80% of the lung cancer images we had were from smokers, which is not the representation of the people who have lung cancer. So thinking about diversity across all aspects of diversity, I think, is really important. And so I'd like to ask the panelists, how do you think about diversity when you're developing your models, and how do you ensure that you have representativeness of the population? And if not, how do you transparently disclose that information, or what are your thoughts on that? And so I'll start with you, Sylvia. And if you, because imaging, often we don't think about representativeness, but it really is a problem also, right?
It is really important. So I mentioned that I work in population outcomes analysis of cancer, and we want to understand the value of a screening test, for example, in reducing cancer mortality rates. And most of the data that we have to inform those models comes from Caucasian community. And we know that it's not representative of other ethnicities and other races. And we have been challenged to explain cancer trends in other communities. And it's really a paucity of data. So it's beholden on us, all of us, to make sure that we collect those data. I don't think there's any other way around it. And so we have tried to infer some of the ideas that we heard before, transfer some concepts from kind of the majority population community to minorities, but it hasn't actually worked, and we can't explain the trends yet. And so until we have the data, I think we're going to be stuck, quite honestly.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly with patient-reported outcomes, I think that's something we're really interested in. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think an example that I worked on with a graduate student a few years ago is helpful in thinking about this issue. So we were trying to develop a deep learning model that would actually predict the outcomes of patients who had rheumatoid arthritis over time. And we used data from the UCSF health system to build this model. It actually performed pretty well, but then, we realized that we wanted to actually understand whether this model performed well in a more diverse population. And so we then tested the model at San Francisco General Hospital, which serves the poor and underinsured individuals in San Francisco, and something very interesting happened. So the model didn't perform as well. That wasn't surprising. But when we actually took the model from San Francisco General Hospital and sort of added what it had learned to the data at UCSF, the model at UCSF performed better. And so I think that, there are multiple reasons, right, to include diverse populations. I think it'll actually improve healthcare for everybody, but it'll also, help us actually understand outcomes and trajectories in populations that may not be represented if we, just use the data that's easier to access. And there are, greater barriers to access. It was harder to actually use the data at San Francisco General Hospital. Imagine collecting outcomes in a population where 70% of people don't speak English. I mean, that provider team has to be really committed, and you have to work with them, right, to make them understand the importance. They need resources to be able to do that, to get that information into the electronic health record so that we can do this kind of research. And so I think it actually requires a multimodal approach that involves patients, that involves clinicians, that involves resources, so that we can do this type of analysis.
I'll take a little bit, maybe a different take on this, because I've been thinking about, how can one avoid bias in the data? And at least there are two ways I can think, in addition to the things that we talk about. One of them is governmental initiatives or large-scale initiatives about collecting the data across, like the Bridge to AI is an effort that NIH has put forward to address some of these issues. So somebody steps in and say, I'll be the sort of the keeper of the data, and you guys all contribute. So that's way we can get a representative population. The other may be to substitute some of the, not everything has to be derived from the data. Maybe there is something about the knowledge that is present in those communities that can be incorporated through things that have been probably collected from other mechanisms, through modeling and so on. So I won't discount the role of other types of modeling mechanisms that people used to do before everything became machine learning driven or deep learning driven, to see if there is something one can bring those back. So some of the latest thinking in design of deep learning models is going to look at incorporating knowledge into the design of these and domain specificity as well. So when you start doing that kind of modeling, some element of the bias could also be addressed, I would think.
In healthcare, and we all have been thinking about this for some time, and so I think that's one of the opportunities where we can bring data and technology together to try and address and move some of these challenges forward. Now, throughout the morning, we've heard about mentorship and how important mentorship is in our career pathways, and really finding a mentor who is supportive, has similar values or interests, et cetera, is extremely important. So I was going to ask the panelists if they can talk a little bit about their mentorship and how and diversity on their team and how that has shaped your career. So Sylvia, I think mentorship is so important. You've already mentioned a little bit of your mentors. So any thoughts there?
Yeah, I really appreciate this topic. So I think that in terms of mentorship, what I'd like to advise is just give mentorship. And I put it in this way in contrast to some advice given by Steve Jobs many years ago, who said, just ask, and meaning just ask for mentorship. And while that advice is really good, and it really works because I do ask for mentorship all the time, and it has made a huge difference for me, there was a time when I was really nervous about asking for mentorship, and I felt too intimidated to ask for mentorship. And so what helped me in the early times of my career was just receiving mentorship from people who would just give it to me unsolicited. And so I want to give you one example of how this played out for me. I was a sophomore in electrical engineering, and I walked into the IEEE student chapter meeting, and they were looking for a new president of the student chapter. And I walked into a room of men. Many of them were sitting on the tables. Others were just pacing around, throwing things at each other. So it was all this physical energy in the room. And I just snuck in and walked into the back and was really trying to be invisible, and just was observing everything. And the student chapter president, the faculty director of the student chapter chair of the electrical engineering department, Professor Yusuf Efe, walks in, and he said, okay, so who wants to run for president? Come up front. And so two guys pop up, and they're in the front of the room. And then Professor Efe looks around the room, and he says, he points his finger, he says, you back there, come up here. So I kind of came up to the front of the room. He says, why aren't you running for president? And I said, I don't know anything about being the president of the student chapter. He said, these guys know nothing either. And so he said, you should run. So I ran, and I ended up being elected, and it was fantastic. I was no longer invisible to my classmates anymore. And so that happened because he gave me advice. completely unsolicited. So it makes a difference to give advice. I can assure you that all of you in here have advice to give somebody, especially somebody in an underrepresented community. So go up to them and just offer your advice. I can guarantee you it's going to make a big difference.
That's a great example. And can you just, I'm going to take prerogative because she is the chair of the Department of Data Science here at Stanford. So how do you ensure that, you know, in your department, there's mentorship and support for all the new students coming on? You have a great bunch of students. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, mentorship is really important, and it's become kind of a cornerstone of Stanford University. This is something we talk about at every level, not only from the students, but also for our faculty at every stage of their career as well. So all students, new students, are identified an academic mentor, and before they pick their faculty advisor, who becomes really their mentor for their research career. And all faculty are given a faculty mentor. But I also reach out to the students. If I can tell that there's a student that may need some additional input, you know, I'll say, hey, come and talk to me. I want to hear how your rotations are going. What are you thinking? I want to share with you my view of the program. So I do reach out to students, and I, you know, encourage our faculty to reach out to the students. And it is something that I feel like we can do better and that we want to improve. And we're actively talking about it. So it has become a very active part of our program.
Thank you. Yunus, do you want to talk a little bit about the mentorship you've had in your career and any differences in what Sylvia shared or similarities would be really interesting?
Yeah, lots of similarities, but you know, one thing that, you know, I've recently been thinking about is just the types of mentorship that I've received and sort of reflecting on the different roles that people have played. You know, you may have heard that you need a team of mentors, and that has certainly been true in my career. You know, I think we focus a lot on having technical mentors, right? So these are the principal investigators, the people sort of that help us with, you know, learning a new skill or, you know, working on a paper or things like that. And those types of mentors have certainly been very important. But there are actually 3 other types of mentors that, you know, I relied on over the last couple decades. So one type has been a career mentor, who actually was very different than the technical mentor. And this is somebody who could really look holistically at my progress, talk to me about where there were gaps, and try to really fill in you know, some advice about the things I needed to do to get promoted in academic medicine. Another type of mentor, which has been really important, is a life mentor. And, you know, different people have taken this role at different parts of my career, but I remember, you know, a particularly vulnerable period. I had just had my first child, and I was a late fellow, early faculty member. And I just felt like there were so many things I needed advice on. And it was actually, you know, the women who were just a few years ahead of me that served as life mentors. And, you know, to Sylvia's point about giving advice, they gave me advice about how long my maternity leave should be, you know, about childcare issues, about where to pump breast milk when I came back to work. And actually, that was incredibly valuable. I needed that support in order to make it through those really hard years. And then the last type of mentor have been people that are often referred to as sponsors. And these are people who really don't necessarily have anything to gain by helping you, but they just do. And, you know, I think actually the example of, you know, somebody asking you to run for president is that's a wonderful example of somebody acting as a sponsor. And in my career, very early on, you know, I was a young faculty member, I had no experience, but there was somebody at another institution who knew I was interested in this issue of quality and data, and so he nominated me to serve on this committee at the American College of Rheumatology, and that nomination really changed the trajectory of my career. You know, I was able to work hard on that committee, multiple leadership opportunities came up, and then I had access to this network that allowed me to build all of these things that I talked about before. So I guess to all of the women in this room, I think we have opportunities to sponsor each other and to ask for sponsorship. And so I really encourage you to, whenever there is an opportunity, like you said, give mentorship, nominate people, put, people's name on the radar, because it really makes a difference.
It does. And I want to just kind of follow on that, a point you just said. So I mentor a lot of people, and a lot of people come to me with, starting a family or, a diversity mentor. And one of the things we're seeing more and more is sort of this diversity tax. So because you're a woman, because you're an underrepresented minority, you often get put on committees or nominated for things because they need diversity on the committees, because they need diversity in whatever it is they're doing. And I always tell the people that, make sure it's a benefit for you too, right? Don't just sit on the committee because you're filling a spot in their diversity panel, but just make sure it's meaningful to you. And you have to be, I think sponsorship is so important, and that's having somebody put your name in the hat or calling you up to run for something. But you have to make sure that the goals are aligned. And I think that diversity tax is something we're seeing more and more. And, I always tell my mentees, just make sure there's value in this committee or value in this position for you also. And so I think that's really important. And I'm not sure if you guys feel that also. I'm sure you felt that in your career when you walk in a room and there's a panel of 8 men and, come join the panel. And you're like, I'm really not an expert in that. So it's important to think about. Tanvir, anything to add on mentorship?
I think all these points are very good, and I don't have too much more to add, other than the fact that you are your best advocate. In many of these situations, you have to make a case. So many times we've all had experiences where people tell us it can't be done, or you're too late, as they said to AI. So you just have to learn to ignore and go with your gut feeling and be willing to fight your case. So I think people will help you, but there's something that you have to give as well to make it work as such. So I think that would be important aspect of maintaining and confidence, as you said. In your case, also you had that. So that's one thing about mentorship. The other thing I would say is that also in academics in particular, one way of mentoring is that the faculty has a much greater opportunity to mentor so much. In industry also we see those things, but the dominance of men is a lot, and particularly in our field, and so we are trying to change that by hiring more women, but there continues to be a challenge.